Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight on this tranquil journey through the hidden rivers of the sea. Before we begin, if you find comfort in these peaceful explorations of our world's wonders, consider subscribing to Gentle Sleep ASMR, where science and serenity flow together like the very currents we'll explore tonight. Now, take a deep breath, let your shoulders drop, and allow yourself to settle into this moment of calm discovery. Imagine, if you will, standing on a shore as twilight deepens into night. The waves roll in with their eternal rhythm, but beneath that surface dance lies something far more mysterious and magnificent. Invisible rivers flow through the ocean itself, some warm as bathwater, others cold as winter's breath, each one traveling thousands of miles on journeys that can span entire lifetimes. These are the ocean currents, and tonight we'll drift alongside them, discovering how they shape our planet's climate, nurture life in the most unexpected places, and connect every shore to every other in an embrace of water that has flowed for millions of years. The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet's surface, holding 97% of all water on Earth. It's easy to think of it as simply a vast, static body of water, but nothing could be further from the truth. The ocean is in constant motion, its waters traveling in predictable pathways that form a complex circulation system more intricate than any highway network humans have ever built. Some of these currents move quickly, racing along at speeds that would make a leisurely walk seem slow in comparison. Others creep through the abyss at a pace so gradual that water molecules might take 1,000 years to complete their circuit around the globe. You've felt the effects of these currents, even if you've never thought about them directly. The warmth of a coastal breeze on what should be a frigid winter day, the abundance of fish in certain waters, the pattern of rainfall that determines whether a region blooms with life or remains parched and dry. All of these phenomena trace back to the movement of ocean water. The currents are Earth's circulatory system moving heat, nutrients, oxygen, and life itself across distances that span hemispheres. They connect the sunlit tropics to the frozen poles, the surface to the seafloor, and in doing so, they help maintain the delicate balance that makes our planet habitable. Tonight's journey will take us from the sun-warmed surface waters, driven by gentle winds, to the cold, dense depths, where currents move in near total darkness, guided by nothing more than differences in temperature and salt content. We'll trace the path of the mighty Gulf Stream as it carries tropical warmth toward Europe, making London's winters gentler than those of cities at similar latitudes. We'll spiral with the Ekman transport, watching water veer to the right in the northern hemisphere and to the left in the southern, all because our planet spins beneath the moving waters. We'll circle with the great Gyres, those massive rotating systems that dominate each ocean basin, and we'll plunge to the depths with the Thermohaline circulation, the slow-moving conveyor belt that links all the world's ocean basins in a 1,000-year embrace. Think of what you're about to experience as a form of meditation, a gentle mental voyage that allows your mind to wander through one of nature's most peaceful yet powerful systems. There's no need to remember every detail or to test yourself on what you learn. Simply let the information wash over you, like those waves on the shore, each fact a ripple that might catch your attention for a moment before flowing onward. If your thoughts drift to other matters, or if sleep begins to pull you under, embrace it. The currents will still be there, flowing their eternal paths when you wake. As we begin our deeper exploration, Notice how your breathing has perhaps already begun to slow, matching the patient rhythm of the deep ocean currents themselves. You might feel your body growing heavier, sinking more comfortably into whatever surface supports you, just as dense water sinks through lighter layers toward the ocean floor. This is natural, this is good. Let yourself flow with the narrative, just as water flows with the currents, offering no resistance, moving where the momentum carries you. The ocean's currents have been flowing for as long as there has been ocean water to flow, shaped and reshaped by the opening and closing of seaways between continents, by ice ages that locked water away in glaciers and interglacial periods that released it again, by subtle changes in Earth's orbit and dramatic shifts in atmospheric circulation. They've carried the seeds of life to isolated islands, brought whale songs across entire ocean basins, and played silent witness to humanity's evolution from shore-dwelling gatherers to global seafarers. To understand the currents is to understand one of the fundamental forces that has shaped our world. So settle in, let your eyelids grow heavy if they wish, and prepare to immerse yourself in the science and beauty of ocean currents. We'll move slowly and deliberately, exploring each concept thoroughly, painting pictures with words that bring this invisible choreography of water to vivid life in your imagination. Whether you journey with us until the very end or drift off to sleep somewhere in the middle, you're exactly where you need to be. The ocean doesn't judge the paths its water takes, and neither do we judge the path of your consciousness tonight. Let us begin by understanding the very nature of these hidden rivers, the invisible architecture that gives structure to what seems like formless water. Ocean currents are, at their most fundamental level, the directed movement of seawater from one place to another. Unlike the random jostling of waves on the surface or the chaotic turbulence of a storm, currents flow in relatively predictable pathways, often maintaining their course for weeks, months, or even centuries. Some are broad and diffuse, spreading their influence across hundreds of miles of ocean. Others are narrow and focused, concentrated ribbons of moving water that create sharp boundaries between water masses of different temperatures or salinities. To understand how these currents form and persist, we must first recognize that the ocean is not a uniform body of water. Far from it. The ocean is layered, stratified by differences in temperature and salt content that create distinct water masses, each with its own characteristics and behaviors. At the surface, particularly in the tropics, water can be quite warm, heated by the relentless sun that beats down day after day. This warm water is relatively light, less dense than the water below it, and so it tends to stay at the surface, spreading horizontally rather than sinking downward. Move toward the poles, though, and the situation changes. Cold air chills the surface water, making it denser, heavier. Add to that the process of ice formation, which leaves salt behind in the remaining liquid water, further increasing its density, and you have water that wants to sink, that must sink, pulled downward by its own weight, to depths where it can find water of similar density. These differences in density, driven by temperature, which we call thermo, and salinity, which we call haline, create pressure gradients in the ocean. Water flows from areas of high pressure to low pressure, just as air does in the atmosphere. And this pressure-driven flow is one of the primary engines of ocean circulation. But density differences alone don't tell the whole story. The ocean surface is also pushed and pulled by winds, those great rivers of air that blow with remarkable consistency, across certain parts of the globe. The trade winds near the equator, blowing from east to west. The westerlies of the middle latitudes, blowing from west to east. The polar easterlies near the poles. These wind patterns have blown for millennia, and over time, they've shaped the surface currents into their modern configurations. Here's where it gets beautifully complex. When wind blows across the ocean's surface, it doesn't simply push the water in the direction it's blowing. The Earth's rotation intervenes, deflecting moving water to the right in the northern hemisphere and to the left in the southern hemisphere through what we call the Coriolis effect. This deflection creates a spiraling pattern in the upper layer of the ocean, with each successive layer of water moving in a slightly different direction from the layer above it, like a gentle twist that extends downward to depths of perhaps 100 meters. The net effect of all this layered movement is that water tends to move at about 90 degrees to the wind direction, a phenomenon that has profound implications for coastal upwelling, gyre formation, and the overall structure of ocean circulation. Now, you might picture ocean currents as uniform flows, similar to how a river flows with all its water moving together in one direction at roughly the same speed. But ocean currents are more variable than that. Even within a single current, there are zones of faster and slower flow, regions where the water spins off into eddies, which are like ocean whirlpools, some hundreds of kilometers across. These eddies can break away from the main current and wander independently for months or even years before dissipating. They transport water with the characteristics of their parent current. Warm eddies carrying tropical water into temperate zones, cold eddies bringing polar water toward the equator, creating pockets of unusual conditions that can affect everything, from fish populations to local weather patterns. The depth of currents varies as well. Surface currents, driven primarily by wind, generally affect only the upper few hundred meters of the ocean, less than 10% of the ocean's volume. Below this wind-driven layer lies the vast realm of deep water, accounting for roughly 90% of all ocean water. And here the currents move much more slowly, driven not by wind, but by the gradual process of dense water formation and the need to replace water that has upwelled elsewhere. These deep currents can take centuries or even millennia to complete their journeys, creeping along the seafloor, bounded by underwater mountain ranges and channeled through narrow gaps between continents. When we speak of the current in a given location, we're often oversimplifying. At any given point in the ocean, water might be moving at different speeds and in different directions depending on depth. The surface might flow northward while deeper water flows southward. Water at mid-depth might circle in an eddy, while water above and below it flows in relatively straight lines. This vertical structure of currents is called the current profile, and understanding it requires measuring temperature, salinity, and velocity at many different depths, a task that has only become truly feasible in recent decades with the development of automated instruments that can be deployed throughout the ocean. Temperature plays a starring role in shaping ocean currents, and the temperature distribution in the ocean is far from uniform. The warmest water is found at the surface in the tropics, where the sun's rays strike most directly. Here, water temperatures can exceed 85 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough for a comfortable swim, warm enough to fuel the growth of coral reefs, warm enough to evaporate rapidly, pumping moisture into the atmosphere that will eventually return as rainfall. But even in the tropics, descend just a few hundred meters, and the temperature drops dramatically. There's a layer called the thermocline, where temperature decreases very rapidly with depth, sometimes dropping 10 or 20 degrees over just a few tens of meters. This thermocline acts as a sort of barrier, inhibiting the mixing of warm surface water with cold deep water and helping to maintain the stratification of the ocean. At the poles, the situation is quite different. Here, even surface water can be near the freezing point of seawater, which is about 28 degrees Fahrenheit, a few degrees colder than the freezing point of fresh water, because the salt depresses the freezing temperature. In these frigid regions, the temperature difference between surface and deep water is minimal. The whole water column might be just a few degrees above freezing, and this relative uniformity in temperature means that other factors, particularly salinity, become more important in determining density and driving circulation. Salinity, the concentration of dissolved salts in seawater, averages about 35 parts per thousand globally, but this average masks significant regional variations. In areas where evaporation is high and rainfall is low, such as in the subtropical regions beneath the descending air of the Hadley cells, salinity can rise above 37 parts per thousand. The water literally becomes saltier as pure water vapor escapes into the atmosphere, leaving the salt behind. Conversely, in areas where rainfall is heavy or where rivers discharge large volumes of fresh water, salinity can drop to 32 parts per thousand or even lower. The Baltic Sea, fed by numerous rivers and receiving relatively little inflow from the saltier Atlantic, has salinities as low as 10 parts per thousand in some areas, so low that it can freeze more easily than typical ocean water. These variations in salinity matter because, like temperature, salinity affects density. Cold, salty water is the densest water in the ocean, and it's this water that sinks to the abyss and spreads across the ocean basins as deep currents. The formation of this dense water happens primarily in a few key locations: the North Atlantic near Greenland, and in the Labrador Sea, the Weddell Sea and Ross Sea, near Antarctica, and a few other scattered locations. When surface water in these regions becomes cold and salty enough, it sinks, sometimes in dramatic events called deep convection, where water drops hundreds or even thousands of meters in a matter of hours or days. This sinking water must be replaced by water flowing in from elsewhere, and this replacement water will eventually cool and sink as well, setting up a continuous circulation. The interplay between wind-driven surface currents and density-driven deep currents creates what oceanographers sometimes call the ocean's two-layer circulation. In reality, the ocean has many layers, many water masses of different characteristics. But thinking of it as having an active upper layer and a sluggish deep layer provides a useful starting framework. The upper layer, in contact with the atmosphere, responds quickly to changes in wind patterns and atmospheric heating and cooling. The deep layer responds much more slowly, on timescales of centuries to millennia, and thus carries with it a kind of memory of past climate conditions, a record written in the temperature and salinity, and even the chemical composition of the water. Between these two layers, there's constant exchange, though it happens slowly and in specific locations. In areas of downwelling, surface water is pushed downward, forced down by the convergence of surface currents. In areas of upwelling, deep water rises to the surface, pulled up to replace surface water that has been moved away by wind or current. This vertical exchange is crucial for distributing nutrients from the deep ocean, where they accumulate as organic matter sinks and decomposes, to the sunlit surface layer where phytoplankton can use them for photosynthesis. It's also crucial for distributing heat and dissolved gases, like oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout the ocean's volume. You've perhaps sensed by now that ocean currents are not isolated phenomena, that each current connects to others, that surface and deep circulation are linked, that what happens in one part of the ocean eventually affects other parts, however distant. This interconnectedness is one of the most beautiful and important aspects of ocean circulation. The ocean truly is a global system, and the currents are the threads that weave it together into a unified whole. Like the gentle pressure of a hand placed over your heart, feeling its steady rhythm. The currents provide a constancy, a predictable pattern that life in the ocean has adapted to and even depends upon. As you continue to relax, feeling your body release any remaining tension, let's turn our attention now to the surface of the ocean, where the first whispers of wind begin their work of setting water in motion. The wind's caress across the ocean's skin is where much of the visible action of ocean currents begins. And it's here that we find some of the fastest and most dramatic flows in all the world's seas. Wind has blown across the ocean since Earth first had an atmosphere and liquid water on its surface. But not randomly. The same differential heating that drives atmospheric circulation, warm air rising near the equator and cool air sinking near the poles, establishes persistent wind patterns that blow with remarkable consistency over the ocean basins. These prevailing winds are the primary drivers of surface ocean currents, pushing vast quantities of water across thousands of miles and creating the basic framework of surface circulation in each ocean. Near the equator, where the intense tropical sun heats both land and sea, warm air rises, creating a zone of low atmospheric pressure. Air rushes in from north and south to replace this rising air, but as it moves toward the equator, the Coriolis effect deflects it. In the northern hemisphere, this creates winds that blow from the northeast to the southwest, called the northeast trade winds. In the southern hemisphere, the deflection creates winds from the southeast to the northwest, the southeast trade winds. These winds blow with remarkable constancy over the tropical oceans, day after day, week after week, pushing surface water westward across the Atlantic and Pacific. The water piles up against the western boundaries of these ocean basins, against the coasts of the Americas in the Atlantic, against Asia and Australia in the Pacific. And this accumulation of water creates a slight but measurable rise in sea level along these western boundaries. Water, responding to gravity, then flows away from these high spots. But as it does, the Coriolis effect again intervenes, deflecting the flow to create the western boundary currents, narrow, swift rivers of ocean water that flow along the western edges of ocean basins. These are the Gulf Stream in the North Atlantic, the Kuroshio in the North Pacific, the Brazil Current in the South Atlantic, the Agulhas Current in the Indian Ocean. Some of the most powerful and important currents in all the world's seas. At higher latitudes between about 30 and 60 degrees in both hemispheres, a different wind pattern dominates. Here, the westerlies blow, winds that move from west to east, pushed by atmospheric circulation cells called the ferrule cells. These winds blow over the broad expanses of the Pacific and Atlantic in both hemispheres, and they push surface water eastward, creating the eastward flowing portions of the major ocean gyres. The water flows until it reaches the eastern boundaries of the ocean basins, the west coast of the continents, and there it must turn, deflected by the landmass, flowing toward the equator as the eastern boundary currents. These eastern boundary currents are markedly different from their western boundary counterparts. Where western boundary currents are narrow, deep, and swift, eastern boundary currents are broad, shallow, and sluggish. The California current off the west coast of North America, the Canary current of the northwest coast of Africa, the Peru current, also called the Humboldt current, off the west coast of South America. These currents move slowly, perhaps 10 to 15 centimeters per second at the surface, carrying water from higher latitudes toward the equator. This water is relatively cold, having come from regions where the sun's heating is less intense. And as it flows along the coast, it has a cooling effect on the adjacent land, contributing to the formation of coastal deserts in many eastern boundary current regions. The wind doesn't just push water across the surface. It also sets up patterns of convergence and divergence in the surface layer that drive vertical motions in the upper ocean. When winds blow in such a way that surface water is pushed together, converging from different directions, the water has nowhere to go but down, creating downwelling zones. These are regions where surface water is subducted, pushed beneath the surface, carrying with it whatever properties it had at the surface: dissolved oxygen, nutrients that haven't yet been consumed, sometimes even floating debris or pollutants. Conversely, when winds cause surface water to diverge, moving apart, water must rise from below to replace it, creating upwelling zones. Upwelling brings cold, nutrient-rich water from depth to the surface, fertilizing the sunlit layer and fueling explosive growth of phytoplankton. These microscopic photosynthetic organisms form the base of the marine food web, and where they're abundant, the entire ecosystem benefits. Upwelling zones support some of the most productive fisheries on Earth, even though they account for less than 1% of the ocean's surface area. The most famous upwelling zones are found along certain coastlines, where the wind blows parallel to the shore in such a direction that surface water is pushed offshore by Ekman transport. The deep water that rises to replace this offshore moving surface water is cold and rich in nutrients, creating a narrow band of high productivity right along the coast. The California coast, the coast of Peru and Chile, the northwest and southwest coasts of Africa. These are all regions of coastal upwelling, and they're characterized by cold coastal waters, often shrouded in fog as warm air from the land passes over the cold ocean surface, and water vapor condenses by abundant marine life, and by their importance to commercial fishing. There's also upwelling in the open ocean, far from any coast. Near the equator, the trade winds blow westward on both sides of the equator, but the Coriolis effect causes Ekman transport to be poleward, away from the equator in both hemispheres. Water moves northward north of the equator and southward south of the equator, creating a divergence right at the equator. Deep water upwells to fill this gap, and as a result, the equatorial Pacific and Atlantic often show a band of cooler, more productive water right along the equator, visible in satellite images of sea surface temperature as a thin, cool stripe stretching across the ocean. Wind patterns can change, sometimes dramatically. The phenomenon, known as El Niño, for instance, involves a weakening or even reversal of the trade winds in the tropical Pacific, allowing warm water that has piled up in the western Pacific to slosh back eastward toward South America. This changes the pattern of upwelling along the South American coast, suppresses the usual high productivity of the Peru current region, and alters weather patterns across much of the globe. The opposite phenomenon, La Niña, involves stronger than normal trade winds and enhanced upwelling in the eastern Pacific. These oscillations between El Niño and La Niña conditions, part of what's called the El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, demonstrate how sensitive ocean currents are to changes in wind forcing and how interconnected the ocean and atmosphere truly are. The depth to which wind-driven currents penetrate depends on several factors, including the strength and duration of the wind, the stability of the water column, which is related to how much temperature and salinity vary with depth, and the presence or absence of other motions, like tides and internal waves. In general, though, wind-driven currents affect primarily the upper 100 to 200 meters of the ocean. Below this depth, the direct influence of wind diminishes, and other forces become more important in determining water motion. During the day, particularly in the tropics, the sun heats the ocean surface, creating a thin, warm layer that can be just a few meters deep. This layer is often well mixed by the action of wind and waves, creating what's called the surface mixed layer. The temperature in this layer is nearly uniform, warm throughout, but just beneath it, temperature drops sharply with depth, creating the thermocline we mentioned earlier. This strong temperature gradient inhibits vertical mixing, so the wind-driven motions tend to be trapped above the thermocline, unable to penetrate into the cooler, denser water below. As night falls and the surface cools, or during storms when strong winds churn the upper ocean, the mixed layer can deepen, eroding into the thermocline and entraining cooler water from below. This daily and seasonal cycle of mixed layer deepening and shoaling is an important part of ocean dynamics, affecting everything from the temperature that ships and buoys measure at the surface to the rate at which the ocean can absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The relationship between wind and currents isn't always straightforward or immediate. When wind first begins to blow over calm water, there's a lag before the current fully develops, a period during which momentum is transferred from the air to the water, and the current gradually accelerates. This adjustment period can be hours to days, depending on the strength of the wind and the characteristics of the water column. Similarly, when wind stops blowing, the current doesn't immediately cease. The water's momentum carries it forward, and the current gradually decays, dissipating its energy through friction and turbulent mixing. This means that ocean currents have a kind of memory of past wind conditions, still responding to winds that blew days earlier, even as they begin to respond to new wind patterns. Oceanographers have developed sophisticated ways to measure wind-driven currents, from drifting buoys that float with the current and transmit their position via satellite, to ship-mounted instruments that measure current velocity at many depths, to bottom-mounted devices that sit on the seafloor and measure the current flowing past them, to satellites that can detect subtle variations in sea surface height that indicate where water is piling up or being depleted. These measurements reveal a picture of surface currents that is both beautifully ordered on large scales, the major gyres and boundary currents that persist year after year, and chaotically variable on smaller scales, the eddies and meanders and ephemeral jets that appear and disappear over days or weeks. Imagine drifting with the surface current yourself, released from shore and carried westward by the trade winds day after day, watching the coast recede behind you until it drops below the horizon, feeling the water beneath you carry you on a journey that might last months. The sun would warm you by day, the stars would wheel overhead by night, and gradually, imperceptibly, you would notice the water growing warmer or cooler as you moved across different latitude bands. You might encounter storms, the wind whipping the water into froth, driving you faster on your westward journey. You might pass through regions of calm, where the wind drops to nearly nothing and your progress slows to a crawl. Eventually, you'd reach the western boundary of the ocean basin, and there you'd be swept into a boundary current, accelerating, feeling the push of fast-moving water carrying you toward higher latitudes. This journey, this drift with the currents, is more than just an exercise in imagination. It reflects the actual paths that water parcels follow, paths that can be traced using deliberate or accidental releases of drifting objects. Scientists have sometimes released hundreds of drifting buoys simultaneously and tracked their movements over months or years, slowly mapping out the pathways of the currents. Other times, accidents have provided unintentional traces, like the thousands of rubber duckies and other bath toys that spilled from a cargo ship in the North Pacific in 1992, and have since washed up on shores around the world, their voyages providing clues to ocean circulation patterns. As your muscles continue to relax, your breath deepening into the slow rhythm of sleep, let's leave the direct action of the wind and move to something more subtle but equally important: the invisible influence of Earth's rotation on moving water. An influence that creates some of the most elegant patterns in all of ocean science. The Earth spins on its axis once every 24 hours, a rotation we're so accustomed to that we barely notice it in our daily lives. But for anything moving across the Earth's surface, including ocean currents, this rotation has profound effects. The Coriolis effect, named after the French mathematician Gaspard Gustave de Coriolis, who first described the mathematics of motion on a rotating platform, causes moving objects to be deflected sideways relative to the Earth's surface. In the Northern Hemisphere, the deflection is to the right of the motion; in the Southern Hemisphere, to the left. Why does this happen? Imagine standing on the equator, where the Earth's surface is moving eastward at about 1,000 miles per hour as the planet rotates. Now imagine traveling toward the North Pole. As you move north, the distance you need to travel to complete one rotation of the Earth decreases, because you're moving to a place where the circle of latitude is smaller. So the eastward speed of the ground beneath you decreases. If you were moving north very quickly, you'd be moving faster eastward than the ground you're moving over, and you'd appear to drift to the right, toward the east, relative to that ground. This is the essence of the Coriolis effect. For ocean currents, this deflection means that water doesn't flow directly from high pressure to low pressure, as it would on a non-rotating planet. Instead, it flows at an angle, deflected to the right in the Northern Hemisphere and to the left in the Southern Hemisphere. The faster the current, the greater the deflection. Eventually, for large-scale currents that persist for many days, the pressure gradient force pushing the water and the Coriolis force deflecting it reach a balance, and the current ends up flowing parallel to lines of constant pressure rather than across them. This balanced state is called geostrophic flow, and it's the dominant balance for most major ocean currents away from the equator. The strength of the Coriolis effect varies with latitude. At the poles, where the entire rotation of the Earth is around a local vertical axis, the Coriolis effect is strongest. At the equator, where the axis of rotation is perpendicular to the local vertical, the Coriolis effect vanishes to zero. This latitudinal variation has important consequences. Near the equator, currents can cross from one hemisphere to the other more easily, because there's little Coriolis deflection to prevent it. At high latitudes, currents tend to flow zonally, east-west, circling around the poles rather than crossing latitude lines. The Coriolis effect doesn't just deflect the surface current, it affects each layer of the ocean, creating what's known as the Ekman spiral. When wind pushes on the ocean's surface, the surface water begins to move, but it's immediately deflected by the Coriolis effect to move at an angle to the wind. This surface layer then drags the layer beneath it into motion, but that deeper layer is also deflected by the Coriolis effect, and it moves at an angle to the layer above. The result is that each successive layer moves in a slightly different direction, rotating to the right with depth in the northern hemisphere, creating a spiral pattern when viewed from above. By the time you've descended to depths of around 100 meters, the current direction has rotated so much that water at depth might be moving in the opposite direction to the surface current. The net effect of all these layers moving in different directions is that the vertically integrated transport, the total amount of water moved by the wind when you add up the contributions from all depths, is 90 degrees to the right of the wind direction in the northern hemisphere, 90 degrees to the left in the southern hemisphere. This 90-degree deflection, called Ekman transport, is crucial for understanding upwelling and downwelling, for understanding why gyres form where they do, and for understanding the overall structure of wind-driven ocean circulation. Ekman transport was first predicted theoretically by Vaughan Wolfrid Ekman in the early 20th century. Based on his efforts to explain observations that Arctic explorer Fridtjof Nansen had made while his ship Fram was frozen into Arctic ice. Nansen noticed that the ice drifted not in the direction the wind was blowing, but at an angle to it, typically 20 to 40 degrees to the right of the wind. Ekman developed a mathematical model that explained this observation by including both the frictional force of the wind on the ice and water and the Coriolis force due to Earth's rotation. His model was remarkably successful, and the concepts he introduced remain central to oceanography to this day. The Ekman spiral is an idealized concept, and in the real ocean, it's often difficult to observe the full spiral pattern because other processes, turbulent mixing, internal waves, interactions with the seafloor or thermocline, disrupt the smooth rotation of current direction with depth. Nonetheless, the basic prediction that wind-driven transport is roughly 90 degrees to the wind direction has been confirmed by countless observations and is used routinely in oceanographic calculations. Consider what Ekman transport means for coastal regions. If wind blows parallel to a coast with the coast on its left in the northern hemisphere, the Ekman transport will be directed offshore, away from the coast. Surface water moves offshore, and to replace it, water must upwell from below. This is the mechanism for coastal upwelling that we mentioned earlier, and it explains why certain coastlines with particular wind patterns are sites of persistent upwelling and high biological productivity. Now imagine wind blowing in a large-scale pattern over the open ocean. In the subtropical regions between about 20 and 40 degrees latitude, the trade winds blow from the east near the equator, and the westerlies blow from the west at higher latitudes. In the northern hemisphere, the trade winds would create Ekman transport to the north, and the westerlies would create Ekman transport to the south. These two Ekman transport directions converge in the subtropical regions, pushing water together. The converging water piles up, creating a broad region of higher sea surface height. And this pile of water then tries to spread out due to gravity. As it spreads, the Coriolis effect deflects it, and the result is a rotating system of currents, a gyre circling clockwise in the northern hemisphere around the elevated sea surface height in the center. The same process occurs in the southern hemisphere, but with opposite sense. The Ekman transports converge in the subtropical regions there as well, creating gyres that rotate counterclockwise. Each major ocean basin has one or two of these subtropical gyres: the North and South Atlantic gyres, the North and South Pacific gyres, the Indian Ocean gyre. Together, they dominate the surface circulation of the world's oceans. And they've done so for millions of years, as long as the continents have been arranged in their current configuration and the atmosphere has maintained similar circulation patterns. The existence and persistence of these gyres has profound implications. The centers of the gyres, where the water has converged and the sea surface is slightly elevated, are regions of downwelling. Surface water is pushed downward, and because it originated at the surface, it's relatively low in nutrients, having already been exposed to sunlight and phytoplankton growth. As a result, the centers of the subtropical gyres are among the least productive regions of the ocean, often called ocean deserts. The water is very clear, a deep blue color, because there's very little suspended matter or living organisms to scatter light. Sailors have known these regions for centuries as the horse latitudes or the doldrums, places where winds are light and variable, and ships could be becalmed for days or weeks. In contrast, the edges of the gyres, particularly the eastern boundaries, where upwelling often occurs, and the western boundaries, where strong currents transport water rapidly, are regions of more intense biological activity. Nutrients are more readily available, either brought up from depth or transported horizontally from productive regions. And the abundance of phytoplankton supports large populations of zooplankton fish, seabirds, and marine mammals. The Coriolis effect also plays a role in creating what are called western boundary currents, those narrow, swift currents that flow along the western edges of ocean basins. The intensification of currents on the western side of gyres is called western intensification, and it arises from subtle changes in the Coriolis effect with latitude. As you move north or south away from the equator, the Coriolis parameter, which quantifies the strength of the Coriolis effect, increases. This gradient in the Coriolis parameter means that the ocean's response to wind forcing is slightly different at different latitudes. And when this effect is taken into account in mathematical models of ocean circulation, it predicts that currents should be stronger and narrower on the western side of the basin than on the eastern side. The mathematics of western intensification were first worked out in the mid-20th century by oceanographers like Henry Stommel, and the phenomenon is well confirmed by observations. The Gulf Stream, for instance, is about 100 kilometers wide and can flow at speeds of up to 2 meters per second, making it one of the fastest currents in the ocean. The Canary Current, on the eastern side of the North Atlantic gyre, is hundreds of kilometers wide and flows at speeds of only 10 to 15 centimeters per second, more than 10 times slower. This asymmetry between western and eastern boundary currents is one of the most striking features of ocean circulation and one of the clearest manifestations of the Coriolis effect's influence. As you sink deeper into relaxation, your thoughts perhaps beginning to fragment and drift, much like eddies spinning off from a strong current. Let's follow the path of one of these western boundary currents, the most studied and perhaps most important of them all, the Gulf Stream. To understand the Gulf Stream is to understand how ocean currents can shape climate, support life, and connect distant parts of the globe in an intricate dance of water and heat. The story of the Gulf Stream begins in the sun-drenched waters of the tropical Atlantic, in the Caribbean Sea, and the Gulf of Mexico. Here, water warmed by the intense tropical sun sits at the surface, heated day after day, to temperatures that can exceed 85 degrees Fahrenheit. This warm water is light, buoyant, and it spreads horizontally, rather than mixing with the cooler water below. The trade winds, blowing from the northeast, push this warm water westward across the Atlantic, and it accumulates in the Caribbean, piling up against the coasts of Central America and the northern coast of South America. Some of this water flows through the islands of the Caribbean into the Gulf of Mexico, where it circulates in the semi-enclosed basin, warming even further under the relentless sun. The Gulf of Mexico acts like a large solar collector, capturing heat and storing it in its waters. Eventually, this warm water must find its way out of the Gulf, and it does so through the Straits of Florida, the narrow gap between Florida and Cuba. As it squeezes through this constriction, the current accelerates, much like water speeding up as it flows through a narrow nozzle. The flow rate through the Florida Straits is enormous, about 30 million cubic meters of water every second, what oceanographers measure as 30 Schwerdrops. To give you a sense of scale, this is more than 100 times the flow of the Amazon River, the largest river on Earth by discharge. Once through the Florida Straits, the current is known as the Florida Current. It flows northward along the east coast of Florida, hugging the continental shelf break, where the shallow shelf drops off into the deep ocean. The water is still warm, carrying the heat of the tropics with it. And it's also salty, because evaporation in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico has removed fresh water and left the salt behind. Off Cape Hatteras in North Carolina, where the continental shelf makes a sharp bend toward the west, the current separates from the coast, flowing out into the open ocean rather than following the coastline. At this point, it officially becomes the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is a remarkable river of warm water in the ocean. Measurements show it's typically about 100 kilometers wide and extends to depths of 800 to 1,200 meters in most areas, though its width and depth can vary along its path. At its narrowest, it can be 50 to 75 kilometers across. Yet it remains vastly larger than any land-based river system in terms of the volume of water transported. The current speed at the surface can reach 2 meters per second, or about 4.5 miles per hour in the fastest parts. To put that in perspective, you could drift across the width of the current in less than a day, but you'd be carried hundreds of kilometers downstream in the process. The water in the Gulf Stream is distinctly different from the water on either side of it. To the north, in the region called the slope water, the water is colder and fresher, properties characteristic of water that has spent time at higher latitudes or has been influenced by outflow from the Arctic. To the south lies the Sargasso Sea, the relatively calm center of the north, Atlantic Gyre, with water that's also warm, but slightly different in temperature and salinity characteristics. The boundaries between the Gulf Stream and the surrounding waters are sharp, often just a few kilometers wide. And they're easily visible in satellite images of sea surface temperature, as stark gradients where temperature changes by several degrees over a very short distance. As the Gulf Stream flows northeast across the Atlantic, it doesn't flow in a perfectly straight line. Instead, it meanders, swinging north and south in great loops that can be hundreds of kilometers across. These meanders are a natural feature of strong currents flowing through a rotating ocean. They arise from instabilities in the current, small perturbations that grow over time into large amplitude waves. Sometimes these meanders become so extreme that they pinch off, forming isolated eddies that separate from the main current and drift away independently. Eddies that pinch off from the north side of the Gulf Stream are called warm core rings because they contain warm Sargasso seawater and they drift northward into the colder slope water. These rings can be more than 100 kilometers in diameter and more than 1 kilometer deep, containing enormous volumes of warm water. They rotate clockwise in the northern hemisphere, and they can last for months or even years before dissipating. Cold core rings pinch off from the south side of the Gulf Stream and contain cold slope water that drifts southward into the warmer Sargasso Sea. These rotate counterclockwise. The presence of these rings creates a complex mosaic of water properties in the western North Atlantic, with pockets of warm water surrounded by cold and vice versa, affecting everything from the distribution of fish species to the formation of fog to the tracks of storms. As the Gulf Stream continues its journey across the Atlantic, it gradually slows and broadens. By the time it reaches the middle of the Atlantic, at about 40 degrees west longitude, it's no longer a single narrow jet, but a broader, more diffuse flow. Here, it's called the North Atlantic Current, and it begins to split into multiple branches. Some water turns south, recirculating back toward the equator as part of the subtropical gyre. Some continues eastward towards Europe, and some turns northward, flowing into the Norwegian Sea and the Arctic Ocean. The water that reaches Europe delivers an enormous amount of heat. The ocean's heat capacity is more than 1,000 times greater than that of an equivalent volume of air. So even though the Gulf Stream and North Atlantic Current are moving relatively slowly by the time they reach European waters, they're transporting vast quantities of thermal energy. This heat is released to the atmosphere, particularly during the winter when cold air from the continent flows over the warm ocean water. The warm, moist air rising from the ocean fuels the low-pressure systems that track across the North Atlantic, bringing mild, wet weather to Western Europe. The climatic impact of this heat transport is profound. London, at about 51 degrees north latitude, has roughly the same latitude as Calgary in Canada or the southern tip of Hudson Bay. Yet London's winters are far milder. Average January temperatures in London hover around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, while Calgary averages around 15 degrees Fahrenheit. This temperature difference, studies suggest, can be largely attributed to the heat brought northward by the Gulf Stream and North Atlantic Current, though the exact proportion of warming from ocean heat, transport versus other atmospheric factors continues to be refined by climate scientists. What's clear is that without this oceanic heat transport, Western Europe would experience significantly colder winters, likely more similar to the climate of eastern Canada or Siberia at equivalent latitudes. The volume of water transported by the Gulf Stream system is staggering. At its maximum, the Gulf Stream transports about 150 million cubic meters of water per second, or 150 sverdrups in the unit oceanographers use, named after the Norwegian oceanographer Harald Sverdrup. To put this in perspective, this is about 500 times greater than the combined flow of all the rivers on Earth emptying into the oceans. This water doesn't just move, it carries with it heat, salt, nutrients, dissolved gases, larvae, and eggs of marine organisms, even pollution and floating debris. The Gulf Stream is a conveyor belt in the truest sense, redistributing properties throughout the North Atlantic and beyond. The existence and strength of the Gulf Stream have varied over Earth's history in response to changes in climate, continental configuration, and atmospheric circulation. During ice ages, when vast ice sheets covered much of North America and Europe, the Gulf Stream was weaker and may have followed a different path. The injection of fresh water from melting ice sheets can affect the density of surface water in the North Atlantic, potentially weakening the sinking of water that helps to drive the thermohaline circulation of which the Gulf Stream is a part. There's concern that modern climate change, with its associated melting of Greenland ice and increased precipitation at high latitudes, could lead to a weakening of the Atlantic circulation. Though climate models suggest this weakening, if it occurs, will develop gradually over decades to centuries, rather than abruptly. The Gulf Stream has captured human imagination for centuries. Benjamin Franklin, among his many other accomplishments, created one of the first maps of the Gulf Stream in the late 18th century, based on information from whaling captains who had noticed that ships traveling from America to Europe took longer if they fought against the current than if they avoided it. Franklin's map showed the path of the current and included advice for mariners on how to use or avoid the current to shorten voyage times. This practical knowledge of ocean currents saved time and money and demonstrated that understanding the ocean could have tangible benefits for human activities. Today, the Gulf Stream continues to be intensively studied, not only for its intrinsic scientific interest, but also for its role in climate and in supporting marine ecosystems. The current and its associated eddies create a dynamic environment where water masses of different characteristics are constantly mixing and interacting. This variability supports a diverse array of marine life, from the tiny phytoplankton that form the base of the food web to the large predators like tuna and swordfish that patrol the current's edges, to the migratory species like loggerhead sea turtles that use the current as a highway during their early life stages. As you breathe slowly and deeply, perhaps feeling sleep beginning to tug at the edges of your consciousness, let's descend now from the wind-stirred surface to the profound depths of the ocean, where an entirely different circulation system operates on timescales that stretch across centuries, a slow but inexorable flow that links all the world's oceans in what scientists sometimes call the global conveyor belt or the thermohaline circulation. The thermohaline circulation is driven not by wind, but by differences in the density of seawater, differences that arise from variations in temperature and salinity. As we mentioned earlier, cold water is denser than warm water, and salty water is denser than fresh water. In certain special places in the ocean, surface water becomes cold enough and salty enough that its density exceeds that of the water below it. And when this happens, the surface water sinks, sometimes plunging to the ocean floor in a dramatic event that can remove millions of cubic meters of water from the surface layer in a matter of hours. The primary sites where this dense water forms are in the high latitudes, near the poles. In the North Atlantic, particularly in the regions around Greenland and in the Labrador Sea between Greenland and Canada, winter cooling chills the surface water, and the formation of sea ice during winter removes fresh water as pure ice, leaving behind saltier water. This combination of cold temperature and high salinity creates what oceanographers call North Atlantic deep water, or NADW, one of the densest water masses in the ocean. When this water forms, it sinks to depths of 2 to 3 kilometers and then spreads southward through the Atlantic Ocean. Similar processes occur near Antarctica, in the Weddell Sea and the Ross Sea, two large embayments along the Antarctic coast. Here, the formation of sea ice creates extremely cold, salty water called Antarctic bottom water, or AABW. This is the densest water in the entire ocean, and it sinks all the way to the ocean floor, flowing northward along the bottom in all three major ocean basins, the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. The Antarctic Circumpolar current, which we'll discuss in detail soon, plays a crucial role in distributing this Antarctic bottom water around the Southern Ocean and allowing it to enter the other ocean basins. The formation of these deep waters in the polar regions must be balanced by the upwelling of deep water elsewhere. If water sinks and spreads at depth, something must replace it at depth, and that replacement must ultimately come from water that was at the surface somewhere else. This upwelling of deep water to replace the sinking water occurs gradually over vast areas of the ocean, particularly in the Southern Ocean and in parts of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The upwelling is slow, with vertical velocities measured in meters per year or even meters per decade rather than meters per second. But over the enormous area where it occurs, the total amount of water upwelling is sufficient to balance the water sinking in the deep water formation regions. Once water has sunk to depth and begins its journey as a deep current, it moves slowly through the ocean basins, following pathways determined by the topography of the seafloor and by the rotation of the Earth. Deep currents tend to flow along the western sides of ocean basins, much like surface currents, a phenomenon that arises from the same physics of western intensification we discussed earlier. The currents are much slower than surface currents, typically only a few centimeters per second, but they're moving water at depths of 2 to 4 kilometers, far below the influence of surface wind and waves. As deep water flows through the ocean basins, it gradually mixes with the overlying water, slowly warming and freshening as it does so. This mixing occurs through a variety of processes: turbulent eddies generated by the flow over rough sea floor topography, internal waves that break and mix the water column, double diffusion where heat and salt diffuse at different rates, creating convective overturning on small scales. The energy for this mixing comes from several sources: the tides as they dissipate energy through friction with the seafloor, the winds through the transfer of momentum to the ocean, and the generation of internal waves, and even the slow cooling and contraction of the Earth itself as it radiates away internal heat. The time it takes for a parcel of water to complete the full cycle of the thermohaline circulation, sinking at high latitudes, spreading through the deep ocean, gradually upwelling, and returning to the sinking regions at the surface, is estimated by oceanographers through a combination of direct measurements and computer models to be about 1,000 to 2,000 years. This is sometimes called the turnover time of the deep ocean. Based on this understanding, the deep water you might sample today likely sank from the surface during the medieval period, when Vikings were exploring the North Atlantic and the first European cathedrals were being built. The water would have carried with it the chemical signature of that time, the temperature and salinity and dissolved gas content that characterized the surface ocean 1,000 years ago. This long residence time of deep water has important implications. It means the deep ocean has a kind of inertia, a resistance to rapid change. Even if something changes dramatically at the surface, it takes centuries to millennia for that change to propagate into the deep ocean. Conversely, it means that changes already set in motion in the deep ocean, such as the gradual warming from the absorption of anthropogenic heat or the decrease in oxygen content due to reduced ventilation, will persist for centuries even if surface conditions stabilize. The thermohaline circulation plays a crucial role in Earth's climate system. By transporting heat from the tropics, where solar heating is most intense, to the high latitudes where the ocean releases heat to the cold atmosphere, the circulation helps to moderate global temperature gradients. By transporting dissolved carbon dioxide from the surface, where it's absorbed from the atmosphere, to the deep ocean, where it can be stored for centuries. The circulation is an important part of the global carbon cycle. And by transporting dissolved oxygen from the surface, where it enters the ocean through gas exchange with the atmosphere, to the deep ocean, where oxygen is consumed by the respiration of marine organisms and the decay of organic matter. The circulation helps to ventilate the abyss and prevent widespread oxygen depletion. The thermohaline circulation also transports nutrients, those essential elements like nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron that are required for phytoplankton growth. Nutrients are depleted in the surface ocean as phytoplankton incorporate them into their tissues. When these organisms die, they sink, carrying the nutrients with them into the deep ocean. There, as the organic matter decays, the nutrients are released back into the water. But now they're at depth, far from the sunlit layer where phytoplankton can use them. The thermohaline circulation is one mechanism that returns these nutrients to the surface, bringing nutrient-rich deep water up through upwelling zones and making those nutrients available for new generations of phytoplankton. The concept of a global conveyor belt, with water sinking in the North Atlantic, flowing south to the Southern Ocean, being carried eastward by the Antarctic Circumpolar current, entering the Indian and Pacific basins, gradually upwelling and then returning to the Atlantic at the surface, is a powerful and useful simplification of ocean circulation. Like any simplification, it omits many details. There are multiple types of deep water, each with its own formation region and characteristics. Water masses mix and transform as they move through the ocean. Some water upwells in the tropics, some at high latitudes. Surface water returns to the North Atlantic through multiple pathways, some through the Drake Passage south of South America, some through the Indonesian seas, some around the southern tip of Africa. But despite these complexities, the conveyor belt analogy captures an essential truth about the ocean. The ocean is not a collection of separate, isolated basins, but a single, interconnected system. Water that sinks in the North Atlantic will eventually reach the North Pacific, though it may take 1,000 years to do so. Water that upwells off the coast of Peru was once at the surface in the Antarctic, perhaps 500 years ago. The ocean has a unity, a coherence, that comes from this global scale circulation. You might imagine yourself now as a water molecule, sinking from the icy surface waters of the Labrador Sea, descending into the darkness as pressure increases and temperature drops. You flow southward, with the North Atlantic deep water, a slow but steady drift that carries you along the continental rise of North America, then Brazil, then past the equator into the South Atlantic. The journey takes decades. Eventually, you reach the Southern Ocean, where the powerful eastward flow of the Antarctic Circumpolar current sweeps you along. You continue eastward, circling Antarctica, until you reach the Indian Ocean. Here, you turn northward, flowing through the deep basins of the Indian Ocean, mixing slowly with surrounding water, gradually warming, gradually freshening. Centuries have passed since you left the surface. Finally, you begin to rise, drawn upward by the subtle upwelling that occurs across vast areas of the tropical ocean. You emerge into the sunlight, warm now, your properties transformed by the long journey. You drift with surface currents, perhaps joining the Indonesian throughflow, moving through the complex straits and passages between Southeast Asian islands, entering the Pacific, flowing eastward across the tropical Pacific, feeling the push of the trade winds, until eventually, years or decades later, you find yourself in the Atlantic again, approaching the regions where deep water forms, ready to begin the cycle anew. This long, slow journey is the heartbeat of the ocean, a circulation that has persisted for millions of years, changing in strength and configuration as climate has varied, but never ceasing, always connecting, always redistributing, always maintaining the balance that allows the ocean and the life it contains to exist. Let's rise now from those profound depths, up through the darkness, through the thermocline, breaking through to the surface once more, but this time at the bottom of the world, in the Southern Ocean that surrounds Antarctica, where we'll encounter the most powerful current on Earth, the Antarctic Circumpolar current, a river of water that circles the entire globe. The Antarctic Circumpolar current, often abbreviated as ACC, is unique among ocean currents. It's the only current that completely encircles the globe, flowing from west to east around Antarctica, without interruption by any continental landmass. This circumpolar path is possible because of Antarctica's location at the South Pole and the particular arrangement of continents in the Southern Hemisphere, with South America, Africa, and Australia all terminating well north of the latitude of Antarctica, leaving an unobstructed path for water to flow. The ACC is driven primarily by the strong westerly winds that blow over the Southern Ocean at latitudes between about 40 and 60 degrees south. These winds, some of the strongest and most consistent on Earth, sailors in the age of sail called these latitudes the Roaring Forties, Furious Fifties, and Screaming Sixties in recognition of the fierce winds and turbulent seas push the surface water eastward. The surface water, deflected by the Coriolis effect, sets up an Ekman transport to the left, which is northward in the southern hemisphere, and this creates a piling up of water north of the current's core. The raised sea surface height creates a pressure gradient that drives an eastward geostrophic flow, reinforcing the wind-driven current. The volume of water transported by the ACC is staggering, even by oceanographic standards. Measurements through the Drake Passage, the gap between South America and the Antarctic Peninsula, one of the narrowest constrictions the current must flow through, indicate a transport of about 135 to 150 million cubic meters per second, roughly 140 sverdrups. Research suggests this is more than the Gulf Stream at its strongest, more than any other current, and vastly exceeds the combined flow of all the world's rivers. The current doesn't just skim the surface, it extends all the way to the ocean floor, several kilometers down in many places, making it a true full-depth current. The current isn't a simple ribbon of uniformly flowing water. It's composed of multiple jets, narrow bands of faster flow, separated by regions of slower flow. These jets are associated with fronts, sharp boundaries between water masses of different temperature and salinity. The main fronts in the ACC are the sub-Antarctic front, where relatively warm subantarctic water meets cooler Antarctic surface water, and the polar front further south, where Antarctic surface water meets the very cold water near the Antarctic continent. Each of these fronts is marked by strong horizontal gradients in temperature and salinity, and each is associated with a jet of eastward flowing water. The position of these fronts and jets isn't arbitrary. It's controlled by the topography of the Southern Ocean seafloor, particularly by the major submarine ridges that extend from Antarctica toward the other continents. These ridges, like the Kerguelen Plateau, east of Africa, and the Campbell Plateau, southeast of New Zealand, steer the current, forcing it to flow around or over them and guiding the fronts to particular locations. The result is a meandering, braided structure with jets splitting and merging, eddies pinching off and drifting away, and a constant exchange of water between different frontal zones. The ACC plays several crucial roles in the global ocean and climate system. First, it connects the three major ocean basins: the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific. Water flows continuously from one basin to the next, carrying with it properties acquired upstream and mixing them with local waters. This makes the Southern Ocean a kind of mixing chamber for the global ocean, homogenizing properties that might otherwise remain isolated in separate basins. Second, the ACC acts as a barrier between the warm subtropical waters to the north and the cold Antarctic waters to the south. The strong eastward flow and the associated fronts inhibit north-south exchange, keeping warm water away from Antarctica. This thermal isolation is one reason Antarctica has been able to maintain its massive ice sheets even during warm periods of Earth's history. The ACC keeps the continent in a deep freeze, surrounded by a moat of cold water. Third, the ACC is intimately connected to the Thermohaline circulation, the deep water that forms in the North Atlantic and the bottom water that forms near Antarctica must somehow return to the surface to complete the overturning circulation. Much of this upwelling occurs in the Southern Ocean, driven by the combination of strong winds, Ekman transport to the north, which pulls surface water away from the continent, and the stirring action of mesoscale eddies. Water rises from depth, warms slightly, and then either flows northward to join the subtropical Gyres, or flows southward toward Antarctica, where some of it will be transformed into bottom water and sink again. The ACC's influence on climate extends beyond the ocean. The water upwelling in the Southern Ocean brings with it dissolved carbon dioxide that has been stored at depth for centuries. This carbon dioxide can then be released to the atmosphere, or it can be taken up again by phytoplankton through photosynthesis and returned to depth as organic matter sinks. The Southern Ocean is one of the most important regions for the ocean's uptake of atmospheric carbon dioxide, absorbing a significant fraction of the carbon dioxide emitted by human activities. Changes in the ACC's strength or in the rate of upwelling in the Southern Ocean could therefore affect the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration and thereby the rate of global warming. The ACC also influences sea ice around Antarctica. The current's strong flow creates turbulence and mixing that tends to erode sea ice from below. At the same time, the cold water and the winds associated with the current promote sea ice formation during the Antarctic winter. The net result is a seasonal cycle of sea ice expansion and retreat, with the ice reaching its maximum extent around September and its minimum in February or March. The exact position of the ice edge and the amount of ice that forms vary from year to year, influenced by variations in wind strength, ocean temperature, and other factors. Variations in the ACC have been linked to variations in Earth's climate on a range of timescales. Studies of sediment cores from the Southern Ocean, which preserve chemical signatures of past ocean conditions, suggest that on glacial, interglacial timescales, spanning tens to hundreds of thousands of years, the strength and position of the ACC appear to have changed in concert with changes in ice volume and atmospheric carbon dioxide. The interpretation from this evidence suggests that during glacial periods, the ACC may have been weaker and may have shifted northward, which could have allowed more stratification of the Southern Ocean and less upwelling of deep water. This would have reduced the outgassing of carbon dioxide from the ocean to the atmosphere, potentially contributing to the lower atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations observed in ice core records from glacial periods. During interglacial periods like the present, the evidence indicates the ACC strengthens, upwelling increases, and more deep water carbon dioxide can escape to the atmosphere. On shorter timescales, years to decades, the ACC exhibits variability associated with atmospheric patterns like the southern annular mode, which describes north-south shifts in the latitude of the strong westerly winds. When the winds shift poleward, closer to Antarctica, they can strengthen the ACC and increase upwelling. When they shift equatorward, the effects are reversed. These shifts in wind patterns can be influenced by both natural climate variability and by human-caused changes, including ozone depletion in the stratosphere and increasing greenhouse gas concentrations. Recent observations suggest that the ACC has been strengthening over the past few decades, likely in response to the intensification of the westerly winds. This strengthening has implications for heat transport, for carbon dioxide uptake, for the stability of Antarctic ice shelves, which can be eroded by warmer water brought close to the continent by stronger currents, and for the ecosystems of the Southern Ocean. The ACC supports one of the most productive marine ecosystems on Earth, fueled by the nutrients brought to the surface by upwelling. Krill, small shrimp-like crustaceans, thrive in these waters, feeding on phytoplankton, and in turn provide food for whales, seals, penguins, and a host of other predators. Changes in the ACC could cascade through this food web, affecting species that have evolved in the harsh but nutrient-rich waters of the Southern Ocean. Standing in imagination on the deck of a ship in the Southern Ocean, you'd feel the relentless westerly winds, see the grey, turbulent waters stretching to the horizon in all directions. Perhaps spot the fin of a whale breaking the surface, or the flashing white and black of a penguin porpoising through the waves. The water is cold, near freezing even in summer, and it seems featureless, just endless grey sea under endless grey sky. But beneath that surface, there's a current of such power and consistency that it shapes the entire global ocean. A a current that has flowed for millions of years, circling the frozen continent, connecting east to west to east in an eternal loop. As your body grows increasingly heavy, your mind drifting towards sleep, let's return to a theme we touched on earlier, but now explore more fully: the phenomenon of upwelling. Those special places where deep, cold, nutrient-rich water rises to the surface and creates oases of life in the ocean. Upwelling occurs when surface water is moved away from a location and must be replaced by water from below. The replacement water comes from depth, and because it comes from depth, it carries with it the characteristics of deep water, colder temperature than surface water, higher concentration of nutrients, different dissolved gas content. When this water reaches the sunlit surface layer, the nutrients it contains become available to phytoplankton, and these microscopic plants respond with rapid growth, blooming in abundance. The most important upwelling regions are found along certain coastlines, where the wind blows parallel to the coast in such a way that Ekman transport moves surface water offshore. The classic example is the west coast of continents at subtropical latitudes. Here, the trade winds, or the subtropical portions of the westerlies, blow roughly parallel to the coast, and the Ekman transport is directed offshore. Surface water moves away from the coast, and to replace it, water upwells from depths of typically 100 to 300 meters. The California current system off the west coast of North America is one such region. During spring and summer, winds blow from the north, parallel to the coast, and Ekman transport moves surface water offshore. Cold water, rich in nitrate, phosphate, and other nutrients, wells up along the coast, creating a narrow band of high productivity. Satellite images of ocean color, which detect the chlorophyll in phytoplankton, show a bright green stripe along the coast during upwelling season, in stark contrast to the deep blue of the offshore waters where nutrients are scarce. Similar upwelling systems exist off the coasts of Peru and Chile, where the Peru Current, also known as the Humboldt Current, brings cold water northward along the coast, and strong southerly winds drive offshore Ekman transport. The coastal waters off Peru are among the most productive in the world, supporting enormous populations of anchovies and other small fish, which in turn support populations of seabirds, whose droppings, called guano, accumulate on offshore islands in such quantity that they've been harvested for centuries as fertilizer. This productivity, though, is not constant. During El Niño events, when the trade winds weaken and warm water spreads eastward across the Pacific, upwelling along the Peru coast is suppressed. The cold, nutrient-rich water doesn't reach the surface, and productivity plummets. Fish populations crash, seabirds starve, and the entire ecosystem is disrupted. Upwelling also occurs off the northwest coast of Africa, associated with the Canary Current, and off the southwest coast of Africa, associated with the Benguela Current. Each of these systems supports important fisheries and plays a significant role in the regional and global ocean productivity. Research on the world's 5 major coastal upwelling systems shows that despite occupying only about 5% of the ocean's surface area, these regions account for approximately 25% of the global marine fish catch. A remarkable testament to the productivity that nutrient enrichment can generate. Upwelling isn't confined to coastlines. It also occurs in the open ocean wherever surface water diverges. We mentioned earlier the equatorial upwelling that occurs where the trade winds drive Ekman transport away from the equator in both hemispheres. Another important upwelling region is in the Antarctic divergence, the zone around Antarctica, where the eastward flowing west wind, drift, another name for the Antarctic circumpolar current, and the westward flowing east wind drift, a coastal current flowing around the Antarctic continent, drive Ekman transport in opposite directions away from each other. Water upwells in the gap between them, bringing nutrient-rich circumpolar deep water to the surface and fueling the high productivity of the Antarctic ecosystem. The nutrients brought to the surface by upwelling have their ultimate origin in the decomposition of organic matter that sinks through the water column. When phytoplankton die, or when zooplankton produce fecal pellets, or when fish die and their bodies decompose, the organic matter sinks, driven by gravity. As it sinks, it's broken down by bacteria and other microorganisms, and the nutrients locked up in the organic tissues are released back into the water as inorganic compounds, nitrate, phosphate, silicate, iron. But this release happens at depth, below the sunlit layer, so the nutrients accumulate there. The only way they can return to the surface, where phytoplankton can use them, is through upwelling or through the slow vertical mixing that occurs throughout the ocean. Without upwelling, the sunlit surface ocean would gradually become depleted of nutrients as phytoplankton incorporate them and the organic matter sinks. Productivity would decline and the surface ocean would become a biological desert. Upwelling is the mechanism that short-circuits this depletion, bypassing the slow process of vertical mixing and bringing nutrient-rich water directly from depth to the surface. It's a form of natural fertilization, fueling the growth that supports the marine food web and the fisheries that humans depend on. The cold water brought to the surface by upwelling also affects local climate. Coastal regions adjacent to upwelling zones often experience cool, foggy conditions during the upwelling season. The cold water chills overlying air, causing water vapor to condense into fog that can blanket the coast. San Francisco, for instance, is famous for its summer fog, which arises in part because of the cold, upwelled water just offshore. The cold water also suppresses rainfall, because cold air can hold less moisture than warm air, and many upwelling regions are associated with coastal deserts. The Atacama Desert in Chile, the Namib Desert in Namibia, the Sonoran Desert in Baja California, and adjacent regions. The variability of upwelling has important ecological consequences. Upwelling isn't constant, it varies on timescales from days to years. Short-term changes in wind strength can increase or decrease upwelling over periods of days to weeks. Seasonal changes in wind patterns create strong upwelling seasons and weak upwelling seasons in many regions. And longer-term climate variations, like El Niño Southern Oscillation in the Pacific or similar patterns in other ocean basins, can dramatically alter upwelling on timescales of months to years. Marine organisms have adapted to this variability. Many species time their reproductive cycles to coincide with periods of strong upwelling when food is most abundant. Larval fish and invertebrates drift in the currents, and their survival depends on encountering sufficient food during their vulnerable early life stages. If upwelling is strong, plankton blooms are abundant, and larval survival is high. If upwelling is weak or mistimed, larvae may starve, leading to poor recruitment and eventual declines in adult populations. There's a phenomenon called recruitment failure that can occur when environmental conditions, including upwelling, are unfavorable during the critical period of larval development. A recruitment failure doesn't mean the species goes extinct. Adult fish can live for many years, but it does mean that cohort, that year's crop of young fish, is weak or missing, and this can have long-lasting effects on the population and on the fishery that depends on it. Human activities can affect upwelling in several ways. Climate change is altering wind patterns in many regions, potentially strengthening upwelling in some places and weakening it in others. Warming of the ocean surface can increase stratification, the vertical separation of warm surface water from cold, deep water, making it harder for upwelling to bring deep water to the surface. Conversely, stronger winds can enhance upwelling, compensating for the effects of stratification. The net effect varies by region and is an active area of research. Pollution can also affect upwelling regions. Nutrients from agricultural runoff or wastewater discharge can add to the natural nutrients brought up by upwelling, potentially leading to excessive phytoplankton growth and harmful algal blooms. Some species of phytoplankton produce toxins that can accumulate in shellfish and fish, making them unsafe for human consumption. Other blooms can deplete oxygen when the phytoplankton die and decompose, creating dead zones where fish and other marine life cannot survive. But despite these human impacts, upwelling regions remain among the most productive and valuable marine ecosystems. They provide food directly through fisheries and indirectly through the support of larger marine ecosystems. They affect regional climate, moderating temperatures and influencing rainfall patterns. They play a role in global biogeochemical cycles, taking up carbon dioxide as phytoplankton grow, and releasing it again as organic matter decomposes at depth. They're regions of intense biological and physical activity, where the ocean's capacity to support life is most dramatically on display. Imagine standing on a coastal cliff, overlooking an upwelling zone, feeling the cool, damp air, smelling the briny scent of the sea mixed with the faint odor of decay that accompanies such productivity. Below, the water is a murky green, clouded with phytoplankton. Seabirds circle and dive, plunging into the water to catch small fish. Seals bask on offshore rocks, their bellies full. The scene is one of abundance, of life flourishing, and it's all powered by the deep cold water that has risen to the surface, carrying with it the nutrients that are the foundation of this profusion of life. Let your mind drift now as your breathing slows and deepens to the broader question of how all these currents we've explored, the wind-driven surface currents, the deep thermohaline circulation, the great boundary currents like the Gulf Stream, the encircling Antarctic Circumpolar current, the localized upwelling systems. How do they all work together to regulate Earth's climate, distributing heat and moderating temperature extremes across the globe? The ocean is Earth's great thermal reservoir. It covers most of the planet's surface, and it has an enormous heat capacity, meaning it can absorb and store vast amounts of thermal energy without large changes in temperature. Water's specific heat capacity allows it to absorb more than 4 times as much heat as an equivalent mass of rock or soil. When comparing equal volumes rather than equal masses, water can store over 1,000 times as much heat as air because water is also much denser. This means that the ocean is where most of the solar energy reaching Earth is stored, particularly in the tropics where the sun's rays are most intense. But this heat doesn't just accumulate in the tropics. Ocean currents transport it, moving warm water from low latitudes toward the poles and cold water from high latitudes toward the equator. This meridional heat transport, from the Latin meridies meaning midday, referring to the north-south direction, is crucial for moderating Earth's temperature gradient between equator and poles. Without it, the tropics would be unbearably hot, and the polar regions even colder than they are. Estimates suggest that the ocean transports about 2 petawatts of heat from the tropics towards the poles, with 1 petawatt equal to 1 quadrillion watts. To put this in perspective, global human energy consumption is only a few tens of terawatts, meaning the ocean's heat transport is roughly 100 times greater than all the energy humans use. The Atlantic Ocean alone transports about 1 petawatt of heat northward, much of it carried by the Gulf Stream and North Atlantic Current. This heat is released to the atmosphere at high latitudes, warming the air and creating the mild climates of Western Europe. The mechanism of this heat release is straightforward, but profoundly important. As warm ocean water flows poleward, it encounters progressively colder air. Heat flows from warm to cold, so the ocean releases heat to the atmosphere. This heat transfer warms the air, making it more buoyant, causing it to rise, which draws in more air from surrounding regions, which in turn is warmed and rises, and so on. The result is that the ocean acts like a massive heating system, pumping heat into the atmosphere and driving atmospheric circulation. The atmosphere, in turn, redistributes this heat through winds and storms. The mid-latitude storm systems that bring changeable weather to much of the temperate regions are partly fueled by the heat released from the ocean. The contrast between warm ocean water and cold continental air masses in winter creates strong temperature gradients in the atmosphere. And these gradients drive the development of cyclones, the low-pressure systems that move from west to east across the oceans and continents, bringing clouds, rain, snow, and wind. The ocean doesn't just transport heat as sensible heat, the warmth you can feel when you touch warm water. It also transports heat as latent heat, the energy stored in water vapor. When ocean water evaporates, it removes heat from the ocean. The energy required for the phase change from liquid to gas. And this energy is carried upward with the water vapor. When the water vapor condenses into clouds and rain, that energy is released into the atmosphere, warming the air. This latent heat transport is significant, and in the tropics, it may be larger than the sensible heat transport. The distribution of ocean heat also affects sea ice, both in the Arctic and around Antarctica. Sea ice forms when ocean water reaches its freezing point, and it melts when enough heat is available to raise the temperature above freezing. The currents that carry warm water into the Arctic, particularly branches of the Gulf Stream that flow into the Nordic Seas and the Barents Sea, help to limit sea ice extent in those regions. Similarly, the Antarctic's Circumpolar current, by isolating Antarctica with a ring of cold water, helps to limit how much warm water reaches the Antarctic coast, allowing sea ice to form more extensively there. Changes in ocean currents can therefore lead to changes in sea ice. And changes in sea ice can feed back on climate through changes in the albedo, the reflectivity of Earth's surface. Ice and snow are highly reflective, bouncing most incoming solar radiation back to space. Ocean water, especially dark, open water, is much less reflective, absorbing most of the solar energy that reaches it. So when sea ice melts, exposing more open water, more solar energy is absorbed, warming the ocean and atmosphere. potentially causing more ice to melt, a feedback that can amplify warming in polar regions. The ocean's role in climate goes beyond heat transport. It's also intimately involved in the global water cycle. Evaporation from the ocean is the primary source of atmospheric moisture, the water vapor that eventually falls as rain and snow over both ocean and land. Patterns of evaporation are partly controlled by ocean surface temperature, with warmer water evaporating more readily than cooler water. Ocean currents, by moving warm and cold water to different locations, therefore influence where evaporation is high and where it's low. And this influences precipitation patterns. For instance, the warm waters of the western tropical Pacific, kept warm by the trade winds piling up water there and by the intense solar heating of the tropics, are a region of very high evaporation and also of very high rainfall. The warm, moist air rising from the ocean forms thunderstorms that release enormous amounts of rain, creating the rainy climates of Indonesia, the Philippines, and the Western Pacific island nations. Conversely, the cold upwelled water of the coasts of Peru or Namibia suppresses evaporation, and the overlying air is relatively dry, contributing to the aridity of the adjacent coastlines. The ocean also affects climate through its influence on the carbon cycle. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, trapping heat in the atmosphere, and the ocean absorbs a substantial fraction of the carbon dioxide emitted by human activities. The ocean's ability to absorb carbon dioxide depends on several factors, including the temperature of the water. Cold water can dissolve more carbon dioxide than warm water, the concentration of carbon dioxide already dissolved in the water, and the rate at which surface water mixes with or is replaced by deep water. Ocean currents are central to this process. The sinking of cold water in the North Atlantic and near Antarctica carries dissolved carbon dioxide from the surface into the deep ocean, where it can be stored for centuries. The upwelling of deep water in other regions can bring carbon dioxide back to the surface, where it may be released to the atmosphere or taken up again by phytoplankton. The balance between these processes determines whether the ocean is a net sink or net source of atmospheric carbon dioxide, and changes in ocean circulation could shift this balance. There's concern that climate change could weaken the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the system of currents that includes the Gulf Stream and the Thermohaline circulation in the Atlantic. Warming of the ocean surface and increased freshwater input from melting ice could reduce the density of surface water in the North Atlantic, making it less likely to sink. If sinking decreases, the overturning circulation weakens, and the northward transport of heat in the Atlantic decreases. This could lead to regional cooling in the North Atlantic and Western Europe, even as the globe as a whole warms. A somewhat counterintuitive but entirely plausible outcome. Climate models project varying degrees of how much the circulation might weaken in response to continued warming. Some simulations show modest weakening, a slowdown of perhaps 10 to 20% by the end of the 21st century. Others show more dramatic weakening, though current projections from climate scientists suggest that a complete shutdown of the circulation is unlikely within this century. Even a modest weakening, should it occur, would have significant consequences for regional climate, sea level, marine ecosystems, and the ocean's ability to absorb carbon dioxide. The ocean is not a passive recipient of atmospheric changes. It's an active participant in the climate system, responding to changes in a way that can amplify or dampen those changes. The currents are the mechanism by which the ocean exerts its influence, redistributing heat, moisture, carbon, nutrients, and other properties in ways that affect climate on all scales, from local to global, and on all timescales from days to millennia. As you lie in stillness, your body completely relaxed, your mind hovering at the threshold of sleep, take a moment to appreciate the elegant complexity of the system we've explored. The ocean's currents, driven by wind and density differences, shaped by Earth's rotation and the arrangement of continents, flowing through layers from the sunlit surface to the lightless abyss, connecting every drop of ocean water to every other in a slow but inexorable circulation. They are one of the fundamental organizing principles of our planet. They have flowed since long before humans existed, and they will continue long after we're gone, testament to the power and persistence of natural processes. Let's bring our journey to a gentle close now, reflecting on the journey we've taken together through the hidden rivers of the sea, and considering what it all means for our understanding of the world we inhabit. We began at the shore, looking out over waves that seemed to represent the totality of ocean motion, but we discovered that beneath those surface ripples lies a far grander choreography. Currents flow at all depths, at all scales, driven by forces as diverse as the caress of wind on water, the patient pull of gravity on dense water masses, the inexorable spin of our planet, and the differential heating of the sun. We saw how surface currents, pushed by the trade winds and westerlies, form the great gyres that dominate each ocean basin, rotating clockwise in the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. We learned about the asymmetry between western and eastern boundary currents, how the Gulf Stream rushes northward along the American coast, while the Canary Current meanders slowly southward along the African shore. And we understood that this asymmetry arises from the variation of the Coriolis effect with latitude. We followed the Gulf Stream on its journey from the tropical Caribbean through the narrow Florida Straits, along the eastern seaboard of North America, and out into the North Atlantic, where it becomes the North Atlantic Current, delivering warmth to Europe and creating a climate far milder than latitude alone would suggest. We saw how the current meanders and spawns eddies, creating a complex mosaic of water masses with different temperatures and properties. We descended to the depths to explore the Thermohaline circulation, that slow but vast overturning system driven by the formation of dense water in the polar regions. We learned how North Atlantic deep water sinks in the frigid seas near Greenland and spreads southward through the Atlantic, and how Antarctic bottom water forms in the Weddell and Ross Seas and spreads through all the ocean basins. We understood that this deep circulation takes centuries to millennia to complete its cycle, giving the deep ocean a long memory of past climate conditions. We circled Antarctica with the mightiest current of all, the Antarctic Circumpolar current, a river of water more than 100 times larger than all the world's rivers combined, flowing from west to east in an unbroken loop around the frozen continent. We saw how this current connects the three major ocean basins, how it acts as a barrier keeping warm water away from Antarctica, and how it's intimately connected to the upwelling and overturning that ventilate the deep ocean. We rose again to the surface to explore upwelling, those special places where deep, cold, nutrient-rich water rises to the sunlit layer and fuels explosions of biological productivity. We learned about coastal upwelling systems like those off California, Peru, and Africa, where the combination of winds and Ekman transport creates some of the richest fishing grounds on Earth. we understood that upwelling is the mechanism that returns nutrients from the deep ocean to the surface, supporting the marine food web and the fisheries that depend on it. Finally, we considered the ocean's role in climate, how currents transport heat from the equator to the poles, moderating Earth's temperature gradient. We saw how the ocean releases heat to the atmosphere, driving atmospheric circulation and influencing weather patterns. We learned about the ocean's role in the carbon cycle, absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it in the deep ocean. And we contemplated how changes in ocean circulation, whether from natural variability or from human-caused climate change, could have profound effects on climate and ecosystems around the world. Throughout this journey, a few themes have emerged. First is the theme of connection. The ocean is not a series of separate, isolated basins, but a single interconnected system. Water that sinks in the North Atlantic will eventually reach the North Pacific. Nutrients that are released at depth off Peru may eventually upwell off California. Heat absorbed in the tropics is transported to the poles. The currents are the threads that weave the ocean into a unified whole. Second is the theme of timescales. Ocean processes operate on timescales from seconds for the smallest turbulent eddies, to minutes for surface waves, to days for the response to changing winds, to years for the seasonal cycle, to decades for the movement of gyres and boundary currents, to centuries or millennia for the thermohaline circulation. This range of timescales means the ocean has both rapid responses to immediate forcing and long-term memory of past conditions. It also means that changes we set in motion today may not fully manifest for centuries. Third is the theme of energy. The ocean is a vast reservoir of thermal energy, absorbing solar radiation and storing it in the form of warm water. The currents are the mechanism by which this energy is redistributed, transported from regions of excess to regions of deficit. The kinetic energy of the currents themselves, the energy of their motion, is ultimately derived from the sun through the intermediary of the winds, which are driven by differential heating, and from the moon through the tides, which we didn't explore in detail tonight, but which also play a role in mixing the ocean and driving some currents. Fourth is the theme of balance. The ocean's circulation is in a state of approximate equilibrium, with sinking balanced by upwelling, poleward heat transport balanced by the cooling of water at high latitudes, and nutrient drawdown in the surface ocean balanced by nutrient release at depth. This balance is dynamic, constantly adjusting to changes in forcing, but it's also remarkably stable over long periods. It's this stability that has allowed life to flourish in the ocean for billions of years. And finally, there's the theme of human impact. We've touched on several ways humans are affecting ocean currents. Through climate change that alters wind patterns and ocean stratification, through the melting of ice that adds fresh water to polar regions, through overfishing that removes top predators from upwelling ecosystems, through pollution that adds nutrients or toxins to coastal waters. The ocean is not unchanging or invulnerable. It responds to what we do, and those responses can amplify or dampen our effects on the larger Earth system. Understanding ocean currents is more than an academic exercise. It's essential for predicting weather and climate, for managing fisheries sustainably, for understanding how pollutants and debris spread through the ocean, for predicting sea level rise and coastal flooding, for protecting marine ecosystems, and ultimately for maintaining the habitability of our planet. The currents may be invisible to our eyes as we stand on the shore, but their influence is everywhere. In the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, and the climate we experience. As you drift now towards sleep, or if you're already in that liminal space between waking and dreaming, let the image of the ocean's currents linger in your mind. Picture the water flowing, always flowing, through sunlight and darkness, through warm and cold, connecting every shore to every other, carrying life and nutrients and heat in an endless cycle. Feel yourself as part of that system, your body, mostly water, your breath participating in the exchange of gases with the atmosphere. Your life sustained by the climate the ocean helps to regulate. The currents ask nothing of us. They flow whether we understand them or not, whether we care about them or not. But in understanding them, in appreciating their beauty and power, in recognizing their role in maintaining the Earth system that sustains us, we enrich our own experience of the world. We see patterns where others see only chaos. We understand connections where others see only separation. We appreciate the deep time over which these systems have evolved and the fragility of the balances that keep them functioning. So rest now, let go. Allow sleep to embrace you as the ocean embraces its currents. Tomorrow, when you wake, the currents will still be flowing. The Gulf Stream will still be carrying warmth northward. The Antarctic Circumpolar current will still be circling the frozen continent. The upwelling zones will still be bringing nutrients to the surface. The hidden rivers of the sea will continue their eternal dance. And you, having journeyed with them in your imagination, will carry with you a deeper appreciation of the magnificent, intricate, beautiful system that is our ocean. Before you go, if you found peace in this journey, if you learned something new, or if you simply enjoyed spending this time exploring the wonders of our planet, please consider subscribing to Gentle Sleep ASMR. Your support helps us create more of these tranquil explorations where science and serenity meet. Sweet dreams. And may your sleep be as deep and peaceful as the ocean's abyss, as refreshing as upwelled water, and as constant as the currents themselves. Good night.